Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you're new to this channel, what you may not know is I'm the Moon Guy on YouTube. And I know that some of you are brand new, and this whole subject matter might be a little touchy for you. So let me kind of brief you on why I started doing moon videos. And to put it lightly, let's just say that I was a space kid when I was a kid. I got great grades, learning all that stuff and doing oral reports and all kinds of good stuff. Man, I just believed everything that was ever told to me. And then in 1991, I was at a electronics show in Emeryville, California, which for those of you who don't know, take San Francisco and then just draw a line northeast over the water, and that's where Emeryville is. And I was a database engineer, brand new database engineer at this company. And we were going to do a presentation of our database software. And so we had all these computers in our booth, real pretty booth. And we weren't allowed to plug the computers in the ground. Some union guy had to do it at $65 an hour in 1991. So I am one of three guys at this conference that are working for the company and setting up this booth. And we get our food, and I'm kind of excited, man. I'm a young kid. I'm freshly 21 years old. Already did the TurboTax thing, did video games, and I'm in a new era. It's a big grown-up, corporate era. So we walk to the table and we sit down with our food. And I don't know these two guys. I didn't know they were two former NASA employees. One of them had a PhD. I don't know if the other one did, but he graduated high school at 16, I think college before he was 20. He was a prodigy kid at NASA. He had 7 patents at NASA related to satellite technology. And I just, in order to break the ice, I said, you would think that if we could land a man on the moon, we could plug our own computers in the ground. And I start shoveling food in my mouth. And this voice across the table, this big dude in front of me, the prodigy kid, who's probably in his early 30s, I think. He says, "You think we did?" And I said, "What did what?" He goes, "You think we went to the moon?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course." And he looks at his buddy and says, "What do you think, man? It was all set up, right?" Both of them have been debriefed, if you want to call it that. The big guy both of them had worked on the Mars mission in the 80s, right? Going to Mars as a human, for journey, which we still haven't done, right? Despite Elon Musk saying he'd be there in 2018. They started talking to each other a little bit in code. And eventually this guy looks at me and says the following. I'm totally paraphrasing how he said it. But he basically said that when he was assigned to the Mars mission in the early 80s, he immediately went in to get the records on the Saturn V because he's like, come on. It's the last time we ever put men into space. It's just a longer journey. We're going to have to start there and build a bigger rocket. Well, supposedly he searched for months until someone pulled him aside at the tippy top and said, "You're the guy looking for the Saturn V schematics, aren't you? The Rocketdyne engines, the whole thing." And he says, "Yeah." He says, "Why are you looking for it?" He says, "What do you mean? We're on the Mars mission. I'm going to make this, bigger rocket. We got to start talking." And they go, "Well, you're not going to find it. We told the public we lost it or destroyed it. It got lost in shuffling," is literally the official story. I mean, there's the fire, the wheel, and going to the moon. You would never lose that amazing accomplishment. Under any circumstance, that stuff would be printed in gold tablets and stored somewhere for the public to see. But he told me that he was told that, hey, look, we're never going to Mars in your lifetime. So just take your paycheck and shut up. We're going to create technology, but, we tried to go to the moon, but we couldn't. So just, it's for the greater good for all kinds of different reasons, right? So that changed his whole outlook on things. This guy was already independently wealthy, not only because of his own salary, but because of inheritance. So he described all kinds of different techniques of how they were not doing this, that they had faked it. He asked his buddy, he said, "What was the latest before you left?" And it indicated, I found out later, that the second guy had left 2 years after he left. And that guy's looking over his shoulder because he does not feel comfortable with the story being talked about in Emeryville. And he just simply said, he goes, look, well, last thing we learned is that the solar radiation from the sun is so deadly that even outside the Van Allen belts, we'd have to surround the capsule in 6 inches of water just to eat up that radiation, which is obviously very heavy to do. And you couldn't have parachutes, you couldn't have a bunch of stuff, or you couldn't have any permeable windows, you couldn't have anything. So I hear this and it goes in one ear and out the other, and I'm so not prepared to hear that information. I was a space kid. I really wanted to believe that. So I just kind of went on with my life. And around 2005, I saw a movie made by a guy named Bart Sibrel, which I interviewed in season 3, I think. It was one of his best interviews in terms of viewership at the time. But he made a movie called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. And in that episode, he recreated everything the guy across the table told me, and then probably 70% more. In addition, he was leaked a piece of film that had proof that they faked a bunch of images of Earth from the capsule, which it seems like they were in low orbit. That's Bart's feeling, and I happen to agree with him, which is already an amazing feat. The Saturn V itself is an amazing feat. We don't need to poo-poo on the whole thing. I don't blame any astronauts at all. But then he had already created that in 2001. So immediately I found a second movie, which was shot 2 years later, because this is 05, 06. And it's a silly name for a great movie, and it's called Astronauts Gone Wild, because there was Girls Gone Wild was a funny little topless series that went on in Fort Lauderdale or something. And what he did was Bart Sibrel went out and got meetings with most of the surviving astronauts from 69 to 72 and interviewed them as if he totally just wanted to document them. He actually had credentials from the Discovery Channel because he was a contractor. So he used those credentials to get these meetings and interview guys. He interviewed guys on the same exact mission in 2 totally different days in 2 totally different locations. And you discover something very interesting in the second movie. None of these guys can sync up their stories. Was there sound inside the lunar module when you were landing? One guy says, no, there's no sound in space. So no, there wasn't any sound. The other guy's like, oh yeah, man, it was totally loud, which it would have been. You have oxygen in the cabin, right? So it would have been really loud. But one guy saw 2001: A Space Odyssey and went with no sound in space. But none of their stories remotely link up. Neil Armstrong refused to talk to him. But in the first movie, he actually took this footage, and the way it works is he said, look, he was actually being championed by the guy that did all the documentation for the first moon landing at NASA. He was the tippy-top documentation guy, so everything would come to him and then go to the president of NASA and all the other heads of state. That guy was on Oprah. His name escapes me at the moment, but I'll put it up on the screen. But he's the one that contacted Bart and said, we got to make this. We didn't go. Well, Bart said, look, if they're going to make a mistake, it's going to be on the first mission, which was 11. And so he told NASA, he goes, I'm making a documentary about 11. Doesn't tell him it's a hit piece. So he says, I want every piece of footage that you can spare about the Apollo 11 mission. Well, what happened was they sent him a gigantic pile of canisters of film. He had a projector. He's going through them. He said the first, half dozen are everything he'd ever seen before, and it was great. He could put it in his reel. But the very bottom can was a can that was marked not for public consumption. He puts that in. It's a 54-minute clip of the first crew, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong, faking these shots of Earth, which is really in a window. It's in a circular window. But they were faking that they were first really far away from Earth, and as time progressed, they perfected the shot, and what they were doing is they were moving a camera up to a round window, which was inside another container window, and they had a little piece of something that was creating the fake horizon on the Earth to indicate time, and they kept faking this and faking this and faking this until the very last second, they turned the lights on inside the cabin, and you could see red lights off to the left. They're faking this shot. And they got it all in chronological reverse order because they wanted to do the faraway one first, which is when they're closest to Earth, technically. And And this is all being stamped by atomic clock every time they turn this camera off and on, right? And so when they're supposed to be far away from Earth, they're really close to Earth. And Neil says to the Houston control, he says, I've got the camera pushed against the window, indicating that all the black around this window was actually supposed to be stars. Well, it wasn't, because it was inside the cabin. It's a little hard to wrap your mind around it at first, but once you see it, it's crazy. There's all kinds of little anomalies too. Neil forgot to talk at one point, and a third voice in a very clear audio says talk, like they're reading a script. When you get the actual flight scripts from NASA about any one of these missions, it's a 2-column script. You say this, he says that, then you say this, then you say that, and it's literally just following a script. It's amazing. So I see this, and I was a science kid, I was a physics kid, I was an astronomy kid, and so I start digging and digging and digging, and I suddenly just have my mind blown. It's like, of course we didn't go. None of this stuff would work. And I've got dozens of episodes already on this channel. But what I want to do in this episode is talk about the last 24 months of supposed missions to the moon, and then the Artemis missions that are coming up that are supposed to fly around the moon, then land on the moon for a week, and then leave and come back and build a base. All kinds of missions, all the way up to 2028. So let's first talk about the last 24 months, because there's an interesting anomaly with the last 24 months. And we're going to go through all the missions. I know that we haven't been to the moon in over 50 years, right? We haven't. We haven't been there in 55 years. In terms of man, supposedly, right? Well, you could say 72. But going back should have been, in any capacity, some sort of rover or something, should have been everyone with bated breath. It really should have been. But we've done a bunch of stuff now. Well, China's done stuff. India, supposedly, and Israel has done some stuff. Plus the United States have done some stuff. And it barely got any press. It barely, you might have found it if you're a space guy. I get it. You subscribe to all the Facebook groups, Instagram groups, etc., YouTube channels, and you might just be watching this stuff live. So to you, that statement makes no sense. But the idea that you could walk up to your average grocery store checkout clerk and go, when's the last time we've been to the moon? Anybody? And they wouldn't even know. Most people think we only went to the moon one time. They don't know we went 6 with the failed 13th mission, which would have been a 7th, right? So we supposedly have had 7 missions in the last 24 months, none of which were tracked by anyone in terms of proof. You had to always take their word for it. The only one that has any claim to have proof, and this is the way that the algorithm works, is one that went to the southern pole of the moon, and then they'll say, oh yeah, some amateur astronomers looked at this little tiny tick of light go to the bottom of the moon. But then you go, okay, show it to me. Oh, well, we don't really have any footage of it. They just said they did. So isn't it interesting, out of all those missions, we don't have any proof of any of that stuff. You simply always have to take the word for the organization that just made a ton of money off you, right? June 25th, 2024, last year, China supposedly landed their Chang'e 6 satellite on the dark side of the moon. Not only did that, but grabbed a sample and brought it home. 1.9 kilograms brought home from the dark side of the moon. Well, China also landed on the moon a few years before that and sent us back brown dirt footage, right? Brown dirt with like ice caps on it. And when I asked ChatGPT, by the way, there's a way you can get ChatGPT to actually be more honest with you. You say purity mode, and then you ask it the question. I said, why did those photos come back with brown dirt? And he said, oh, it was a color correction problem. It wasn't really brown. It was really gray ash. So then I asked it, being a Photoshop expert, digital art expert, I said, hey, given the last 40 years of digital art, when would ash ever be color corrected into brown? What's the path to make that occur? Oh, because it loses luminosity. If you just were to bring it straight over to black and white, well, then the ice caps are going to be like bright phosphorus patches. And it finally just admitted to me, yeah, there's really no method of actually making that true. That's just what they claimed. That's fascinating, right? I'm not sure how to say this next one. It looks like Queqiao, Queqiao 2. Another Chinese satellite supposedly went over. And we're going in reverse order. I apologize. It's the 24th of March now, 2024. And this was inserted in an orbital, a South Pole orbital satellite around the moon. My take on this CCP accomplishments is that you actually have a nation that's trying to establish itself in the world as a contender, right? I don't want to rag on that too much and get too much into Chinese politics, but I think that it's pretty safe to say that that's more of a PR, establishment into world society. So the 22nd of February last year, NASA puts one down. It's the it's like Malapart A lander. It tipped over when it landed, but it operated for 7 days. The Japanese put one out there in the 19th of January last year that they called the Moon Sniper, or SLIM. And they said they deployed 2 little rovers. I didn't even see this at all until I looked it up. I did not know this entire thing occurred. Isn't that amazing? Why isn't it international, like blockbuster news? This should be red headline, just for the day. It's just amazing if you can get anything to that big gray ball in the sky. Well, a day before that, on the 18th of January last year, NASA tried to put one up there and it didn't work out at all. It just completely missed its landing attempt due to they said a propulsion leak. Now, going back to 2023, on the 23rd of August, India puts down their lander. And again, it's on the South Pole. There's this super fascination with the South Pole. We're gonna loop back on all of this in a theoretical term because all these missions have something in common. And on the 19th of August, 2023, the Russians tried to land one, and it didn't work out. It completely failed. So what are the commonalities with all these missions? Now, Israel also had supposed little lander that supposedly landed, and they said it lost communication. Then all of a sudden it was back on and had some photographs. Because when I think of space travel and landing on the moon, Israel's the first country that comes to mind, right? Let alone India. All of these missions are outside of any normal landing zone. They're not landing on the bright side of the moon to take those beautiful photographs like we see in our Apollo 11 through 17 missions. But what if you did? What if you did land anywhere in a normal zone in the Sea of Tranquility or any of that kind of stuff? Especially Japan that deployed 2 rovers, supposedly, right? I mean, we deployed rovers 25 years ago that lasted 15 to 17 years a pop on Mars. Why haven't we sent any of those to the moon? I mean, the Mars, that's really far away, right? Why isn't NASA, just to kind of cover the base, put it up there and drive the rover over to one of our other landing spots? Wouldn't that be cool? See where we left all of our stuff? And it should identically match all of the photographs that Neil Armstrong and all the other guys that were on the moon, the videos that never filmed the Earth one time, right? 6 missions to the moon, and they never pointed a video camera at Earth. How could you stop an astronaut from pointing a video camera at Earth? How could you stop that? You couldn't. Someone would, and they're playing golf. The 17 mission was such a joke. They're singing, tiptoe through the tulips, playing golf. And that level of consciousness and IQ would never point a camera at Earth to say, hey, Mom, look at me, no hands, right? Sure seems like the set they created wasn't capable of faking such a thing. There's some photography out there, which we'll get into in a little bit here. But all these missions are on the dark side, the South Pole, near the bright side, but not quite on the bright side. I literally have to go and look up. I'll try to find some of the photographs that supposedly this SLIM Moon Sniper Japan episode happened, and they had 2 rovers. I want to see what's going on. Why haven't I seen those pictures? I go to japantoday.com at least 3 times, if not 7 times a week. I don't remember them ever putting those photos up there. That would be a massive accomplishment for Japan, wouldn't it? Now, before we go into Artemis, let's tour around some of those little factoids that just haven't panned out over time. right? Some of the smoking guns that say, well, we probably didn't go the first time. It doesn't mean we haven't developed new technology to go again. I doubt we've shared that technology with all these other countries, though. So one of the very first problems you have with getting to the moon is getting away from this big giant ball called Earth. And they have told us for years, for 55 years, they've said, hey, we use a slingshot model. We use the Earth's gravitational force to slingshot whatever we put in space to Mars, to the moon, to Venus, to Mercury, to Jupiter, and beyond, right? Well, what's interesting about these slingshot theories is that, as I've illustrated in several episodes, but it's been a while, is that when they show like reconnaissance satellites going into Jupiter's orbit, right, they'll show you a true slingshot orbit model where it's got a big giant loop the first time it goes around, and then it comes around, it tightens and tightens and tightens until it goes screaming into the atmosphere of Jupiter, taking as many photos as possible along the way, right? Well, the funny thing is that it's like an equation in mathematics. If you have a value on the left and you have an equal sign in the middle and an expression on the right, then whatever's on the right, when solved, will equal whatever on the left, even if they look totally different. As long as there's an equal sign in the middle, those two should be equal. So where's the equal sign in the equation of a slingshot model, let's say to the moon? Well, let's just say you're going to slingshot into orbit at the moon, and you're going to slingshot into orbit around or away from the Earth. So you're going to have all those concentric circles at the landing zone, moon, Mars, Jupiter, all these places where you're trying to land, right? Can't really land on the surface of Jupiter, but you can take a lot of pictures before it gets burned up or pummeled to death, right? Well, every single time you've ever seen this slingshot theory in an image from NASA, especially if you just pay attention from 1963, let's just say, to 1969 when they said they hit the moon the first time, they just draw one circle around the Earth. That's it. There's no concentric circles, but they're talking about some slingshot theory. Well, when you're reaching your destination in the equation, let's just say that's the right side of the equation, because the equal sign's floating between Earth and whatever planet you say you're going to. So if you're going to Venus, the equal sign's between Earth and Venus. The way you left Earth is going to be the way you land in Venus, if you're trying to do it stably and not just crash into the surface, right? Talking about orbit here. Well, you're going to have to slingshot away from the Earth. If they want to say that they're doing that, they could say they're just turning on a big old motor and getting away. Well, that means every time you have to go around the Earth a few times, and you're going to have to get further away from Earth and further away from Earth until you finally let go and use that gravitational force to throw you in a perfect direction towards that body in space you're trying to go to. Man, the mathematics of that would be insane, wouldn't they? I did the calculation once, taking the service module and the lunar lander attached to each other, and then the volume of Earth. And just the circumference volume of Earth, or I should say the spherical three-dimensional space of Earth, was no less than 3.6 billion times bigger than the volumetric space of these two aircraft. So in terms of the gravity you're trying to get away from, boy, you got a lot of force you got to introduce to this thing. But the thing was, the Saturn V never had those stages. Once it let go of all those rear stages, this thing's just going in an orbit around Earth, right? And somehow leaves Earth with no extra force. It just skips out. Hey, we're just going to say slingshot, and poof, you're gone. You just have to take their word for it. You see, there's a lot of places in NASA's history where they simply call it miracle math. When you take the Viking 1, which was a satellite that landed on Mars in 1976, left in 75. Well, I was studying, how on earth would you get a transmission from the surface of Mars all the way to the Earth, which is just a teeny star in the sky? How would you do it, right? Well, the theory is they got this little antenna, a little CB antenna on top. It's really long, supposedly. And it would wobble around until it just shot a straight line right at that little dot in the sky. An absolutely impossible feat. Some of you have studied a different theory where you looked at some experiments where a laser was shot across a frozen lake. And technically speaking, the target should be down off the edge of the Earth, but it wasn't. It was actually still in sight with the telescope. Wasn't supposed to be, but somehow, the curvature of the Earth is in the distortion of the atmosphere, bends light around, around the corner there. But you have a really high-powered laser. I watched these experiments myself, and they hit this target at the other side. And by the time they hit the target on the other side, it was a diffused, gigantic blob of light on the other side. And that's just a tiny distance on the surface of the Earth. Okay, so now take the moon, average distance, 236,000 miles away. It's on a wobbly orbit, right? But take the Mars rovers and the Viking lander, right, which just landed perfectly, by the way. Oh my gosh, just perfect. Didn't have any problems with rock being in the wrong place for the little lunar foot, Same thing with all 6 missions to the moon. There was only one mission, I think, where they actually put the lunar module down a little cockeyed, a little bit, right? But there was a little rock there, and man, they got rocks the size of like RVs and houses, right? Man, you land in that wrong spot, what are you going to do? You're going to die. You're going to roll over and die, and there's no way to leave, right? Never had any problems. Ever. Just a tiny rock, 3 foot by 3 foot. Could have made that thing roll over on its belly. Would have been over. They would have been stuck. Not enough oxygen with their little tiny thermos container capsules that had compressed oxygen that made them, by mission 17, they lasted on the moon's surface for 25 hours. But the scuba divers on Earth, with 2 gigantic tanks and trained to breathe properly in those tanks, can only get about 3.5 hours on a lucky dive. And that's if they don't see a shark. So the theory is that, okay, somehow using X-band, 30 to 60 megahertz from an X-band radio broadcast, okay, it's just super simple for a vehicle on a cockeyed piece of land on Mars, okay? Remember, it's not completely level. Mars is rotating. Mars is going through the solar system. Earth is rotating. Earth is going through the solar system. It was no problem for that vehicle with, I think, 60 watts of power on it to send a signal, send images, let alone, it's just, maybe maybe one of those might be kind of believable with a gigantic, one of those crater arrays here, which they use for SETI. They can listen to like a trillionth of a frequency, a trillionth of a watt coming from space, right? That's what SETI does. Nope, it's no problem. They basically sent digital photograph information from Mars in 1976. But man, if I can't keep my cell phone running in Southern California when I turn a corner from having 4G and 5G, it would be a miracle, right? But for Mars, 1976, no problemo. Nixon had a telephone call with the boys on the moon in Apollo 11, virtually no delay at all. Plus, they also had a color streaming video coming back from the moon. Amazing. Almost live. But you got the Saturn V rocket, which is one of the most amazing creations of man's entire history. I mean, there's just nothing about it that isn't phenomenal, right? Kind of reminds me of ICBMs. But this rocket takes off, and what's happening in these Rocketdyne engines, those first stages? Well, the first stages are engaging atmosphere. But the first thing that's happening is there's combustion that's pushing up against the cone, and that's a certain percentage. But the majority of what's going on is that fire is pushing against atmosphere, really thick, soupy oxygen here on Earth. And so there's a much different percentage of that force going on. So then it takes off, and then it's going through the murky, variable waters that are the atmosphere. You ever flown in a plane and hit an air pocket, and the whole plane just drops like 20 feet, 30 feet, who knows, right? And everything flies into the air. That's the instability of our atmosphere. And we're launching out of Florida. And so it's very thick, humid air that's providing resistance. So the big theory is that once these stages get done, right, because it did push that rocket, you watched it, it worked, right? It's letting go of those stages. It worked. But once you start getting into zero atmosphere, now what's happening to the percentages? You're still going to get force, this equal and opposite reaction thing from the fuel hitting the cone. But what percentage was that in the first place? And what percentage was actually hitting the atmosphere? What they want you to think of and want you to believe is that because there's no atmosphere, my gosh, this engine works so much better. You don't need that much thrust when you're in the vacuum of space. Okay. Now what's wild is, when you look at all the missions up until, say Apollo 7, 8 supposedly went to the moon, did a tour, came back. 9 just went into low orbit. 10 went into another tour around the moon, and then we got ready for 11. Well, I used to give you this analogy, and I'm going to give it to you again so you can think about this in your head. If any of you are sitting in a room with an average 8-foot ceiling, if you were to say, I'm going to divide the ceiling from the top to the bottom in millimeters. What's amazing about that, because it's base 10, right, is it's almost perfectly at the very top, 236,000 miles up. Okay? Every millimeter constitutes about 100 miles up. Okay? It's a little longer than the moon, so maybe draw down 6 inches from the top of your ceiling, maybe 5 inches, then you'll be right there at the moon. In all of our previous missions with the same technology, we were only 2 millimeters off the ground at approximately 200 miles up. It's an amazing accomplishment to put men in orbit 200 miles up. But what they're trying to tell you is that by 8, they just chose to go the rest of the distance to the top of that wall, all the way up to the moon. Having never done it before, they did it the first time with no problems. And you could lament about Apollo 13, which has a gigantic 10-inch thick report about what happened, but only one paragraph lightly alludes to an explosion that happened on the outside, causing the whole mission to fail. But they don't really tell you what happened, because maybe it didn't happen, right? Remember, by Apollo 12, I Love Lucy was being knocked off TV, and listeners were complaining. Why are we looking at all this moon stuff? We're so done with the moon. So if you think short attention spans are new, think again. So in order to kind of galvanize the world, it was like, oh, you don't give anything about this moon mission stuff, we're going to make you care. 13 goes up, phantom explosion happens, never documented in any detailed manner. And then it's that Apollo 13 movie that you've seen with Tom Hanks and crew, right? A very well done movie, and you should pay attention to that movie. I believe it was 1996. They were able to simulate complete believability of zero gravity in those vehicles. So if you see zero gravity footage today, you're thinking, well, 1996, Ron Howard, he was able to do it and no problem at all. But now you've got to steer this vehicle. The service module, which is above the lunar module, right? They never quite tell you how on earth does the lunar module detach from the bottom of the service module, right? It's the bullet-looking thing with the little cone, and the lunar module is the thing that lands on the moon. And they're both right side up. But somehow in space, okay, these things detach, and the shield around the lunar module falls off without bumping it and causing any problems, okay? So that happens. And then they detach this thing, and they never tell you how this works. They never show any footage of this ever occurring, but they had windows in the service module. They could have filmed it, but they never did. Somehow this lunar module detaches, and the whole thing comes around and attaches the 2 tops. So two of the three astronauts can crawl through the top of the service module into the lunar module and head to the moon. The only weird thing is when you ask NASA about where do you put the parachutes when they landed with the lunar capsule, where are those parachutes? I mean, they're 3 parachutes the size of your house. No exaggeration. Well, they say they're in the cone of the service module, compressed to the thickness of bark. Okay. But that's the hole that they crawled through to get to the lunar module. That's really weird how that worked, right? Then you see one of the first episodes of Outer Limits, filmed in 1962-63, where they actually simulated an invasion from another planet. And they literally talked about the hoax of how they were going to do it. They put a spaceship that they built in the back of a cargo jet and pushed it out. It's kind of funny. But this thing goes all the way to the moon, right? Right through this thing called the Van Allen belts, which none of the astronauts knew about the Van Allen belts when Bart Sibrel interviewed them about the Van Allen belts, which are extremely extremely electromagnetic waves that protect the Earth from all the coronal mass ejections, from all those meteorites coming in. When you see a meteorite burn up, well, it's coming through those, which shouldn't cause it a heck of a lot of problem unless it's conductive, and then it could start burning up from conductivity, and then it hits the Earth's atmosphere and burns up due to friction, right? Well, the Van Allen belts start about 1,000 miles up. They're on average, they're about 20,000 miles thick at the equator. And then it all condenses at the North Pole and the South Pole. It's the most volatile electromagnetic condensed field at the top and the bottom, which is why you see the northern lights, because they'll dip down every once in a while and strike the atmosphere. Well, these guys don't even know the thing exists. When I was doing the radio show from 2014 to 2015, the Project Orion was greenlit by NASA, and we were like, what the heck is that? And he said, well, what we're trying to figure out is how to put man through the Van Allen belts without killing them, because it's so radioactive, we can't do it. They actually said this in multiple interviews. Well, we went to the moon 8, 10, and 11 through 17. Even Apollo 13 went to the moon and came back, supposedly, right? So why do you need Project Orion? It's not a problem. These things don't even exist. Well, they do exist, is the problem. In 1998, the space shuttle went higher up than it ever went. It's because the mission's been scrubbed, because you can't find it in history, but CNN actually did an article about it on their website, which has also been scrubbed. Okay, Bart Sibrel mentions this in his Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon movie. And they said basically the astronauts started seeing shooting stars with their eyes closed. Everyone started puking their guts out. They scrubbed the mission. They descend down to the space station height and basically got their act together and then grounded the mission. They pulled them back down. Luckily, everyone was okay. Well, that's not even completely to the Van Allen belts. All right? Now, you take that guy who was sitting next to my buddy, and he said, look, once you get past the Van Allen belts, just the ambient radiation from the sun was so deadly they were going to need 6 inches of water around the 1/4-inch thick aluminum capsule that went to the moon to protect these guys from dying. Well, all right, so you got these rockets in space that need to do a lot of maneuvers. So I don't think the math personally works out to actually guide and correct a vehicle once it's hurled into space. I think you can make relative position changes to your yaw, pitch, and roll. But the vehicle, once it leaves Earth's atmosphere and starts just flying in space, I believe you can't really affect its trajectory much, because I think the percentage is almost nothing. I could be wrong. But one thing I do know, before we can actually get back to the moon's surface where we're going, is that when the lunar module, came back to the service module, you've seen that footage of that top part blasting off of its kickstand, and it's going perpendicular to the surface of the moon. It's going straight up. It has no forward momentum whatsoever. Well, the service module's traveling about, you get a bunch of weird answers, but the minimum speed I've ever heard is about 3,500 miles an hour. So you have a vehicle that's relative speed is 0, and it's going to connect with the service module, which is haul and buns. It doesn't go straight up and then suddenly start going 3,500 miles. And if you're trying to find an object in space, even if the service module was in some geocentric orbit with the moon, which it wasn't, you're talking about closing your eyes, taking a dart, and throwing it into a field and trying to find a little tiny dart pad that's somewhere in the ground out there. You're not going to be able to rendezvous those two vehicles. But they showed you footage of this happening, didn't they? When you look at the lunar module coming back up to the service module, you see this retro rocket thing happening. And the vehicle actually stops completely on a dime. I mean, it goes rotate, stop, rotate, stop, rotate, stop. I put that through ChatGPT, finally broke it down, all of its little filters, and I said, that's not possible, is it? Even if you have one on the other side trying to counteract it, it's not possible to get absolute stop in space using retro rockets, and it finally just gave up the ghost, and it goes, absolutely not. There's no way that could happen. It would always be in some rotational movement. And then trying to dock that, trying to dock two, gaskets together in the middle of that craziness is just impossible. You would have had to have one of those cones you put on your dog so it doesn't lick itself, right? You would have had to have some catching device like they use for refueling tanks when they have a fighter jet that has to drop down its little buoy down there. Or sorry, when the tanker drops it down, it has a little cone interface that bumps around until it gets into the hole. You would have had to have something like that. But let's just say they magically pulled this off. They got the lunar module detached from underneath the service module. Without any video, they rotate that thing around and attach it perfectly to the top, because that's got to be really easy the first time you've ever done it, when you've never done it before. And you did it perfectly 6 out of 6 times. Never a mistake, never a problem. Wow. They should just play the lottery instead of raping us for all the money they spend every day, right? But this thing detaches. How fast did we say the service module was going? About 3,500 miles an hour. A listener once said it was only 1,600 miles an hour. It's okay. I'll actually give you the benefit of the doubt, and we'll reduce this thing down to 1,000 miles an hour. I think that's at least 28% of what it really was. 1,000 miles an hour. All right. And you got this lunar module thing. It's one of the silliest looking things you've ever seen in your life. And now it's screaming down to the surface of the moon. It's got a little place it's supposed to go. And of course, it's all timed by astrophysics, man. Right? Once you hear that, your brain just dials out and you're thinking, magic math. That's what NASA literally says. It was magic math that got the Viking 1 to send its signal back to the Earth. They never revealed the math of how that worked, because we need to have secrets from 1976, right? So, okay, there's just a little booster, a 10,000 pound thrust booster on the bottom of the lunar module. All right, but you're going, let's say 1,000 miles an hour. I think you're going a lot faster than that, but let's just say you're going 1,000 miles an hour. Do you have any idea what a 1,000 mile an hour plane would look like if it flew over your head? I mean, if those of you in the Navy who've seen jets, buzz the tower and that kind of stuff, you know potentially what 1,000 miles an hour looks like. It's a blip. Now imagine somehow this lunar module's got a tiny bit of fuel. You've seen the footage. They're coming down to the moon's surface, especially Apollo 11. And all it has to do is just blow that engine, and 1,000 miles an hour stops. But it never, ever looks like it's going 1,000 miles an hour relative to this ground that they've rotated underneath it, right? Remember, they made props. They made 2 gigantic props in NASA. One was a gigantic sphere of the Earth, all contoured out with clay, and then this wild surface wall with a dolly camera on a rail, like a choo-choo train, so they could actually drop the camera down to the surface to do a special effect to this thing, right? Nope, just a little burst from a 10,000 pound thrust engine negates all the lateral movement of at least 1,000 miles an hour. And suddenly this tripod thing with four little pads lands with no problem. 6 out of 6 times. Never a rock, never a problem, never a crater. Could be a little crater, could be a little something. Never a problem. 6 times out of 6 times. Isn't that wild? I think it's wild. Now they've added a little vignette to that landing sequence for Neil Armstrong. They started this story probably about 10 years ago, maybe 15 tops, where the computer actually crashed a few seconds before the landing, but it was told to reboot itself, and it rebooted itself just in the nick of time, adding that suspense element so that when you tell this story to your buddies at the bar, well, you know what happened, man? The computer crashed. The rope memory computer crashed. They never really explained how rope memory works. We don't have any working computer rope memory. Rope memory was this weird technique. They said they were actually storing the data on the lunar module. It's gigantic for one, so you'd actually have a tremendous amount of this cabin taken up with rope memory. They have this elegant footage of women weaving this rope memory like a tapestry. It's just hilarious. And then to prove to you, I never heard of rope memory, and I did tons of reports on this when I was a kid. Never heard of it once. looked through encyclopedia books and books dedicated on this. Never heard of this stuff until well into the 21st century, probably about 2015. But the way I found out was supposedly, this just should make you laugh out loud, NASA mailed the actual rope memory that they had developed to this guy on YouTube to put in his house, where he had supposedly a machine that could read it in his house, and he was just testing it and proving that it worked. Crazy, right? Couldn't have been the stuff from the moon, because that stuff's still on the moon. But rope memory in the capsule potentially comes back, and he gets a copy of this stuff, and you're just like, really? We don't have the schematic for the Saturn V or the Rocketdyne engines that Bezos dug up off the bottom of the ocean. But we have rope memory just handed out to guys, man. They have a YouTube channel, right? Absolutely nuts. So this capsule on the moon. Well, what's going on there? We got two astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the first one, supposedly, hopping out of this thing. They shoot, of course, Neil Armstrong's famous line in grainy black and white. Well, there was a color camera on the service module already, and all the other footage on the moon, when they're walking around, is all in color. The Hasselblads had color. So why would you take take footage of the most amazing accomplishment of man's history since fire in the wheel in grainy black and white, and then not allow any of the television channels to have a direct feed from this? It goes to NASA, supposedly, and is projected on a wall in Houston Control. And they have to film the wall. Grainy footage, just in case there's any problems, whatever, right? Okay. When they got their formula down, it got a little bit better, but they never filmed that sequence ever again. Guys getting out. It's always just Hasselblad shots, or if this first astronaut brought one of the color cameras out and set it up, you get a little bit of that, but you don't really have a lot of photos of these guys crawling out because there's a little problem with the lunar module. The door size isn't big enough to allow a fully inflated astronaut to actually climb in and out of the thing. It's not possible. How do we know that? Well, one of the astronauts' nephews went down to Florida, where they had a life-size replicant of one of the lunar modules in a museum. I've seen it. And he asked his guide, he was getting a guide because he was related to one of the astronauts. He says, "What if I get a little closer to that thing? I mean, like really get close to it?" And the guy, "It's a replica, right? Big whoop." Well, the assistant who was giving the guide said, "Well, let me just go ask somebody if you can get close to it." He gets close to it anyway. The guy walks off, and he has a tape measure with him, one of those little cloth ones, and he goes up to the door and measures it. It's not remotely big enough to allow the shoulder width and this backpack they got on to get through that door. Well, he didn't get a chance to look at it much more because the guy came back with another dude who threw him out of the museum. I mean, come on, you don't need to throw the guy out. Get away from there, come on. Sorry, we can't let you get close to that. Come on, whatever. Everyone's nervous. Don't worry about it. Can I take you somewhere else? No. Threw him out. Boom. Because he came away with some empirical proof that this vehicle is actually a problem. Now, I know there's a lot of different smoking guns. I like the ones that are just awesome. Never filming the Earth with the video camera. I think that's just good enough right there, don't you? Come on. Stop lying to yourself. But what did NASA say about being on the surface of the moon? What was one of the biggest considerations of being on the surface of the moon? It was the hot and the cold zones. Now, they've been there 6 times, so this was not just a guess anymore. What I'm telling you is what they empirically told you was the absolute truth. That when you're in the sunlight, you're at 280 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, 320 light's a match, right? But when you're in the shadows, it's negative 280. Which is more than a 500-degree swing. So let's think about that for 1 second. You got this costume on. It's your spacesuit. Yes, the boots were smooth on the bottom until they put these little rubber fittings on them, which had the moon, the little slats that you see in the moon footprint. So that's a bogus claim. They love it when you jump off on those bogus claims. So yeah, their boots were smooth leather until they put these other little fitting things on the bottom, little booties on the bottom. But if you're standing on the moon, on the light side, of course, all the 6 missions did that. That means the front of your body is 280 degrees, but your back is 280 below zero. Now, what kind of outfit could stabilize the internals of an astronaut in that condition? You'd be literally almost on fire in the front, and you would be necrosed in the back. You'd be frostbite times 20 on the back. There's no such outfit. They only tested those outfits once in the deserts of California. It was 160 degrees inside the suit within minutes, and the test subject passed out in the suit. They never tested them again. Never tested them again. But they worked the first time they were on the moon. Isn't that fascinating? And now Elon Musk's ones are absolutely hysterically funny looking. They know you just don't care, so they don't care either. They're just willing to present enough that you'll believe, and that's about it, right? Well, they also had these little plastic tips on their fingers, right? That allowed them to have some tactile feedback, right, when they touch things. Well, if that's the case, what's going to insulate you against 280 degrees on the outside and negative 280? Your fingers would either be boiling or freezing. And that rubber would have to be utterly amazing not to lose a little bit of its composition, especially in a 25-hour mission. But what do you need when you're in a spacesuit more than anything while you're there? You need oxygen. Oxygen is a pretty important thing. If you go up to the NASA website and you break down the Apollo 11 suit, which was never re-engineered between 11 and 17, they have a thermos container, literally like a large thermos container that is supposed to contain all the oxygen. Well, what they said was that they had compressed oxygen. So it decompressed as it was coming out and you breathed it. One of our listeners was sort of an aficionado on the compressed oxygen, and because they use it in different places on Earth, and they said you cannot breathe that stuff for a long period of time, otherwise you'll get all kinds of illnesses, okay? Well, the first mission barely spent any time on the moon. Well, the last mission made it almost a whole day. I think it said 25 hours. 25 hours on one of those little thermoses. And they didn't have the wherewithal to say that they were being swapped out. Wouldn't that have been nice? Like, okay, so we've been out here 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever you think that little tank could possibly do with its compressed oxygen. Now we got to go back inside the lunar module, close the door, use the oxygen in the module. Now we got to swap out these tanks, right? We got enough to be here for whatever, 25 hours. No, one tank is always good, never re-engineered, always have plenty of oxygen. Again, if you have anybody who scuba dives, ask them how much time they can spend underwater with two gigantic tanks on their back. Now, there's a lot of little tchotchkes out there that I'm not mentioning, and I've mentioned them on my other episodes. So if you're thinking, man, you're missing this other stuff, it's because I don't think they're the best examples. But one of the most amazing examples was that, this is what my buddy talks about all the time, is that in the first several missions, they said, this thing is so perfectly balanced, the Saturn V with its boosters, that literally what they said on TV in the Apollo 11 is they were exaggerating, but they said they couldn't bring up a paper clip. This thing was so well balanced with whatever was in the payload, right? Now let's just say 50 pounds. Let's say they couldn't take up another 50 pounds, right? They said paper clip, let's give them 50 pounds. It would have just thrown off the trajectory of the vehicle, messed up the landing sequence with the lunar module, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden they bought a 700-pound car. The Moon Rover. Moon Rover is just an old warmed over Jeep, right? They stripped it down. They put some pretty wild tires on it. Pretty amazing engineering, to be honest. But they never filmed once pulling this thing out of the bottom of the lunar module and setting it up. But I think they did it 3 times. I think it was 15, 16, 17. I mean, you'd think one time. One of the first pictures of the rover, or this moon buggy, the tire doesn't have any tracks going left or right. It's just plopped down like it was dropped by a crane down onto a set. That was a little weird. I mean, I suppose we don't know how it works, but the frame definitely doesn't collapse. That's the interesting thing. There's something odd about that rover. If you speed up all the footage that you ever see of the rover, the best speed I ever got was 2.4 times speed. All of a sudden, it looks like a rover on Earth. The little crow's feet, the crow's tail that comes off the back, it falls perfectly. But if you're in a you're in 1/6 gravity, it would go a lot further than what we would have on Earth. But it looks perfectly normal to Earth once you speed it up. But that's not the big smoking gun with the rover. Other than saying that they couldn't bring up anything super heavy, and suddenly, without any recalibration of the Saturn V, without any increase in the booster thrust of the Rocketdyne rockets, Not once. 700 pounds went all the way there. Didn't mess up anything. Okay? All right. Zero gravity, obviously zero gravity, you'd be all right. Once you start getting towards the moon, now your vehicle weighs 700 pounds more. And you only have the same 10,000 pound thrust engine, and you're going 1,000 miles an hour to 3,500 miles an hour as you're heading towards the surface, right? It's just insane, right? But if you pay attention to all the moon buggy footage you've ever seen, the guy inside the vehicle never moves. He's like a prop. He never waves his hand. In fact, there's a little steering wheel in the front, and he doesn't seem to be touching it in the first place. Huh. Now, these guys are playing golf. These guys are goofing off like crazy. They're having the time of their life on this set. And they never just went, hey, man, and they're just, dragging it around like they're on a beach. These astronauts have definitely done dune buggies on the beach before. Guarantee it. They're rock stars. Guarantee they've done that, at least in testing, right? But suddenly they're just comatose mannequins on the moon in this thing, right? Wherever that car goes, they're just bouncing up and down. They don't turn their head. They don't move their arms or anything. Because it's probably not a real dude inside there. What will be the problem? Well, you've created this set. Maybe the rover is not 1:1 scale. That could be part of it. Or maybe it is, but if you put a 180-pound dude on a set and you've got this cement dust, which is faking the surface of the moon, maybe it gets stuck. Maybe it'd be a problem. Maybe they tried it didn't work. Now, I'm going to take a pause here because Bart Sibrel interviewed a guy that was the son of the head of security of what, on his deathbed, he claimed to be the head of security for the Air Force base in South New Mexico, where they filmed this whole thing. They had two hangars that were attached to each other to make one gigantic hangar, and they greenlit all this construction on the base so they would bring in metric tons of cement dust without causing any alarm. Cement is obviously gray. Utterly ingenious, man. Utterly ingenious. Of course, there's no stars in any of the footage because they couldn't fake that. How would you put a star map on the inside of a warehouse? The most infinitesimal inaccuracy an astronaut student in high school would recognize that the constellation screwed up because it turned a corner inside the inside of this place. So what we think was going on was that these guys had wires on them, which dissolve into the blackness of the sky, and from far away, with a certain exposure, the light's going to crawl on both sides of that wire and cancel it out. Magicians have been doing this forever. Again, I saw David Copperfield in 1993 at the Flint Center in Sunnyvale, California, and he used a sparkling curtain to hide his wires. Now, we all knew he was on wires, right? And he's an amazing guy. Consequently, every time he does a forward flip and a back flip in 93, it's exactly the way they do it on the space station, right? They have to pull their arms together and get out of the way of the wires and do this spin. It's really funny. You would never see a guy in an X, right, in a jumping jack fashion doing a flip in the space station. You'll never see it. They could probably engineer it now that I said it, but they haven't done it yet. I have a great episode on the space station if you want to have a full breakdown of what that place is. And within 2 months of me doing that episode on the space station, they announced they were getting rid of it. When they just finished modules, they just finished putting that thing together. Now it's obsolete. They're going to crash it into the atmosphere. That's a little weird. Okay, so now we talked about the escaping, right? They get that lunar module. They go straight up from the surface of the Earth, but somehow they get the same forward momentum as the service module. Just give it to them, whatever, right? Use your brain. They reattach. And of course, the service module has a little bit of gasoline in it, and it booms over to Earth, man. No problem leaving the gravitational force of the moon. Just go. Just turn it on and go. All right. There's no resistance out there. It's just totally easy to do this, right? All right. But then what happens when it gets to Earth? Well, you've all seen the illustration. It's very dramatic. This lunar module thing pops off, this little cone thing, right? Remember, there's a door at the top. That's how they got into the lunar module. But at the same location is where all the parachutes are. That's amazing. It's a magic trick. But you have a thing shaped kind of like a bullet, right? The tip of a bullet. What they want you to believe, and Caltech kids have torn this apart with big machine learning over 10 years ago, is they want you to believe that a bullet can come into a surface of friction and not rotate. That the bottom part of this bullet, at the perfect angle, okay, which again, big machine learning computers at Caltech could not figure out how to do this, right? This guy said he let the simulation run 45 days to pick every possible conceivable angle imaginable for this lunar capsule to hit the atmosphere and not go into a roll. And he called NASA on the phone. And he says, man, this thing always rolls. And it rolls so bad that anything inside there would be Swiss cheese in 2 seconds, be like goulash in a couple seconds. Everyone would be dead. But they want you to believe there's a blast shield on the bottom. They lose radio contact, right? That's the other one, is they switch audio feeds, right? And it comes down, and then it just pops parachutes out of nowhere. 3 gigantic parachutes that when you really look at the photographs of it coming in, you measure the volume of these parachutes and think about them trying to compress down. What do we have, airbag solutions with the inflatable dust in them way back in the day? No. You just push this bark into the atmosphere and suddenly it unfolds perfectly, right? The thing is if they're not really going to the moon, if they're not really getting into the lunar module, then that upper part of the capsule could have parachutes in it. So when they come out of a 200-mile orbit and get down, they're not having to go through that amazing blast shield thing at all. They just come down, maybe even head first, like a normal bullet would. They pop those parachutes, and the parachutes will straighten the vehicle out, and they just land in the ocean. Everyone's a hero. And they've done it several times with low orbit stuff up until that point, right? Now, I want to address, because it always comes up, if I don't address it, it starts hitting the comments, and it's very easy to get rid of, which is the involvement of one Stanley Kubrick in they want to say Apollo 13 missions, but obviously Apollo 11. There's this fake confession video out there. And I'm not trying to name drop, but Vivian Kubrick and I worked together for several months. She actually mentioned this on Alex Jones' show, which is funny.
I don't see how he could have been off somewhere. And I was just talking to a friend of mine that I met on Twitter, Mark Lowe. He's got a show called Deep Thoughts. And he introduced me to Bart Sebril. How do you say his name? Bart? Yeah, astronauts gone wild, all that stuff. Because really, I'd ignored all of that fake moon landing, and I absolutely believed that we landed on the moon and everything. I didn't want to look at it because it upset me that people accused my dad of faking this. So I hope I'm not going all over the place here, but I'm just trying.
You're doing a great job. Keep going.
So,
her and I worked together, and we figured out the easiest way to prove that Stanley had nothing to do with this New Mexico filming in June of '68. That's when they said this guy said that he was part of it. I mean, his details on this are phenomenal. Bart has one up there. Just go to Sibrel, SIBREL.com. I think he's also Moon Man or something like that. But just look him up, Bart Sibrel. So Stanley's biggest contribution was indirect, if anything. The filming of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was, I believe, from 65 to probably 67 before he had it in the can. It was crawling with NASA astronauts. I mean, those spacesuits that you saw and the space helmets that are in the movie are all designed by NASA scientists and were far more brilliant than was ever expressed in the actual movie. If you go look at all the making of, and you hear these interviews with the astronauts back in the day, or not astronauts, sorry, these NASA scientists back in the day, explaining the helmets, explaining the memory and the computer organization, the suits, it was phenomenal what they did. One, the NASA scientists told him there wouldn't be any slow motion gravity, right? So when they're walking on the moon down to the monolith in the movie, they're not floating anywhere, right? They don't have magnet boots or anything like that. So that's funny. But it was Doug Trumbull and company, the head of special effects, a very famous guy, a very amazing guy, working on all the special effects. So that when they needed to do it and composite all the space footage, they had everything in the can. They could figure it out. But what we did was we looked at the fact that Stanley always took his family with him wherever he went. He came home for dinner every night of every movie he was ever shooting, except for Barry Lyndon, where there was threats out for his life because of Clockwork Orange. The family had to stay in a hotel. He still came home for dinner, but they weren't physically with him just to kind of keep everything safe, right? And this is all above ground stuff. But her passport and his passport looked the same. He came over in April of '68 to do a press ducket for the movie and get it released over here. But then he's back in England by the time they supposedly filmed this stuff in June. They rode a boat. They didn't fly a plane because he didn't like planes. He accidentally was in a plane crash at one point, and that freaked him out back in the 50s, so he never flew in planes. So she also said they were all together in July of 69 when the landing happened, and, he didn't express to the family any disbelief in what was going on. But she made a really good point. She said, look, she hadn't looked at any of the footage, and she had kind of avoided the conversation her entire life until her and I met. And I finally got her to understand that I wasn't accusing her father of anything, and that kind of opened the conversation up. But her and I have spent hours and hours and hours on the phone going over this stuff. We no longer do that anymore. But she finally started looking at the footage, and she goes, why would anyone think my father had anything to do with shooting this entire thing? All these shots are horrible. Like, my father could not stomach any of the shots from the moon landings. And if you just look at any of his creations, you'll just go watch 2001. The last thing he would have made before supposedly participating in this thing, it doesn't make any sense. They don't need to open it up to him. But the other one was the guard who on his deathbed told his son that he actually shot a colleague who was threatening to tell everybody it was a hoax. He shot the guy, killed him, then went and got cleared for doing it. And he felt horrible his whole life because as he believed eventually, he knew it was fake. He said, I killed a guy for a fake moon landing. I actually committed the sin of sins. And so his son went up to the point he caught cancer in his early 70s, and he put out a recording out. Bart actually sent him the equipment to film himself. His house was raided, by the way, right around this time because they knew he was going to do this because they were filtering the communications. He gave a little testimony. He's very sick. And he basically said that there was a roster of names that were allowed into the warehouse during the shooting. And he said Henry Kissinger was on the list, but he said he never saw Henry Kissinger. I think he said he never saw Henry Kissinger, but he said LBJ was on the list. And he said that Kubrick is nowhere on the list. He's just nowhere a part of this whole thing. And of course, why wouldn't he say that if he was there during the first mission? Anyway, so you could put that to bed. In terms of that confession of Kubrick, we studied his face because I actually thought a long time ago that looked accurate before I met Vivian. And she said, look, go get photographs of my father in his later years of life. The bags under his eyes are most distinct thing about him. And by the time he shot Full Metal Jacket in the late 80s, those things were really dark and very prominent. And this guy didn't have any of that. So you can put that to bed. The whole thing about The Shining, he may have been alluding to something he suspected, but he's not a participant in it. It's two different things. You could make a movie if you believe we didn't go to the moon and you had an opportunity and you had the visualization in your head to do room 237 and the carpet, which they said the launch pad was a hexagon, which is not. If you go look at the real one, it's actually more like an octagon. It doesn't even look anything like that carpet. That carpet was a last-minute choice because Vivian was talking about the movie The Shining with the doc, the little kid, right? Danny. The room 237, we'll go in different orders. Room 237 was just a spur-of-a-moment conversation because the Overlook Hotel technically existed in Colorado, but the one they used was in Oregon. Different name hotel. They were worried they had a room 216, and they didn't want him to use that in the movie. So without skipping a beat, he's filming a shot. They come up to him, blah, 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 about 216. He goes, well, fine, make it 237, whatever. Wasn't a big deal. The carpet was assigned to Vivian, who was on the art team. She went into London, picked out a ton of carpet samples, brought it back to her father. He didn't like any of them. And so the carpet that was picked by the art director was one of the most famous carpets of that era. I forgot its name, but it's super famous. It's not his creation. It's not a unique thing. And in terms of the woman sewing together, knitting the sweater together that had Apollo 11 on the kid's shirt, symbolizing the launch, Vivian's in the room when the woman was looking at her task to knit this thing together from scratch. And she goes, I'm Italian. I have nothing to do with, she wasn't American. She had nothing to do with kids in America. She goes, what are kids like in America? And someone just blurted it out. Well, they went to the moon, just do a little, rocket design. And so she just knitted this thing together in front of everybody. So in terms of that all being planned out, I'm sorry, it just wasn't. Right? It just came together in a really unique way. And I think people were pretty brilliant to come up with the conspiracy around that. And I fell for it, So let's talk about this Artemis stuff. Because they're really bragging it up a storm that the president of the United States is really into it. And it's just going to happen, man. So Artemis 2 is scheduled here in the future here. It's supposed to spend 10 days going in orbit around the moon. Right? Just taking some new photographs of the whole thing, right? The shots we can actually get of the surface of the moon are just crazy good from here. It really is. So 2 is supposed to go around and do a reconnaissance. So Artemis 3 is the big one. This thing should be international news, and it's going to be fascinating to see what they come up with, because they're on the hook for making the moon look like they did from 69 to 72. We'll see if they can pull that off, right? Remember, there was a couple missions where they went back to the moon in the 70s, and they used the same exact set twice. One was very smooth. I'll show you a picture in the video. And the other one had tons of rocks. It was the same exact set. Same exact mountains in the background. When questioned, NASA simply said, oh, well, it's so close to the other landing site that those mountains look exactly the same in the background. Ha ha. Ha ha ha. Anybody who lives in the panhandle of Oklahoma and they start driving towards the Rocky Mountains, or you're coming from Kansas towards the Rocky Mountains, or you're coming from the north to Rocky Mountains, they look different from different angles, okay? But these things are not high enough in the air to be visible between landing zones. That's the other funny thing. But yeah, they're going to spend 1 week on the moon with Artemis 3. It's going to be interesting to see what platform they come up with. Are they going to recreate the Saturn V platform with the lunar module underneath the service module, where somehow in space they can rotate those things around and touch them together? It'd be interesting to see that footage for the very first time, when they did it 6 times with a window outside the lunar module, and they never filmed it once. Nowhere. Like the hardest thing that they got right the very first time they tried. And then what are they going to do about launching off the surface of the moon and getting that forward acceleration to match up with the service module and Artemis 3? If you see that again, you'll be wiser than the guy next to you. But you should mention it if you can. So then you got Artemis 4 and 5. And this is where you got the lunar base. They're going to create a lunar base on the moon. I'm going to show you some photographs I got online that were just artist renderings based on their conversations with the NASA folks. They're going to 3D print these sort of honeycomb homes. They're really tall. It's like a vase kind of turned upside down. And they're all kind of cool inside, man. They're just going to be, if you could do this if you actually had the technology to pull it off, right? They've been talking about this kind of thing since the mid-'80s. You see, the thing is, because I paid attention to this as a kid, they kept saying they were going back to the moon tons of times. The Russians sold tickets to go and circle the moon, but they never did it. I remember Omni magazine raffled off a ticket to go in orbit around the moon. How is that even possible, right? It's just a magazine. The tickets, I remember billionaires buying tickets for $300 and something million to go to the moon. Never happens. There's always an excuse why it doesn't happen. All this stuff right now was supposed to happen in 2018 or 2020. And I told you guys years before that, because this show's 10 years old, there's going to be an excuse why that doesn't happen. Poof. We got all kinds of wild stuff, didn't we? 2019, 2020. The big thing about building a base, because we've had this done several times on Earth, haven't we? We've built Arctic bases in the North Pole and Antarctica and the South Pole, and they're really hard to maintain. It took us decades to set up things in the South Pole. Tons of bases were built in the 40s. Remember, Hitler was trying to get whale oil in the South, and of course he's accused of building those bases down there. I don't know why they would be hiding that 80 years later. If he actually did build the base, and they run into it and go, wow, look at this, man, the Nazis built a base. But you get into these really formidable zones where the temperature's horrible. You have no supplies. You run out of oxygen, what are you going to do? I guess they'd send up resupply rockets or something, just like they do for the space station, right? And in terms of your waste, well, they can recycle stuff like the space shuttle, like the space station. You could drink your own pee and all that kind of stuff. Food, well, if you're going to stay up there forever, that's 365 days for one person. Would be a lot of rations and you have to have water and you have to have oxygen. You can't just pull it out of nothing, right? A Navy SEAL could have a drigger and he could dive with it and it's going to recycle his air and pull it out of the water, and it's going to be amazing. The guys can stay under water for an hour plus and there's no bubbles coming off. It's just tremendous. So what are they going to do on the moon, right? A bunch of compressed oxygen? The fact that this is supposedly going to happen by 2028, this permanent moon base thing is supposed to start. And it's not in the press. It's not on the tip of everyone's tongue. Well, when they play back that footage with Kennedy about safely sending a man to the moon and back home, he announced that and the world was galvanized. I mean, the whole planet was waiting with bated breath for this to occur. And they paid attention. I mean, I wasn't alive yet. I was alive, but I was in my mom at the time in the July of '69. But I remember being a kid, unable to speak, didn't know how to speak. And I was at my great-grandmother's house outside in a little cradle, I guess. And they let me, the moon was in the shot, right, from the cradle. And my mom pointed at that moon. She goes, there's men up there. There's men on the moon right now. Whenever time that was, right? It must have been 12 or something, right? 12 or was 13. It'd be 14. But I couldn't speak yet. I remember not being able to say, oh, wow. But I can remember what she was saying. And I remember thinking, like I understood what she said. It was weird. I can still see it in my head to this day. If you're frustrated about this episode because you tend to gravitate towards the belief that we went, just understand you're listening to the voice of a guy that would love nothing more for all that to be true. And I'm actually okay if they somehow came up with a different platform that could just easily get back. I got no problem with that. I want to see it. I want to see what they've done. And what I want to see is a continuous feed from launch to landing on the moon. No sleight of hand. Oh, we lost communication. Oh, we're back on. You know, that's what happened with a lot of those SpaceX landings. Just before it lands, boom, they lose control. They lose communication with this camera. It's really bizarre, right? All indications are that in the 60s, after the V-2 rocket did what it did in World War II, bombing the heck out of England, that everybody who had a military thing was like, we need those. Von Braun is given a complete clean bill of health, smuggled in the United States, becomes the head of NASA. I mean, just unbelievable, man. A Nazi becomes the head of NASA, right? And then all this stuff happens, right? And remember, if you look back in the late 50s, before this mission to the moon was greenlit, we were making ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. We had the missile crisis at Cuba. So we wanted missile technology. But how do you tell the public we want to spend $15 billion in money back then on missile technology? It's much easier to greenlight something to the moon, pay for it in that realm, stage the other thing. I mean, if you can go. But if you can't, whatever, just put it in the basement, right? But Von Braun was on the Walt Disney show about, I think, 1956. And this brings us back to 2001, which is phenomenal. He stood there on TV and he laid out the plan to get to the moon. Now, there's a rumor he wanted to go to Mars first. I find that super hard to believe. I mean, Mars is over 100 million miles away. I mean, give me a break. That's just inconceivably far away. And they somehow strong-armed him to pick the moon. But anyway, he gives a presentation on the Walt Disney show. I got slides from this I'll put on the episodes and tons of my other episodes. But he talked about what they did in 2001: A Space Odyssey. For those of you who didn't see the movie, by the time they get to the modern age, which is in the near future, it's supposed to be 2001, but obviously it would be at a minimum 2100 or 2101. It would be 2001. They had built this giant wheel in space, and this Dr. Floyd is coming from Earth in his Pan Am vehicle, and he's flying up to the wheel. And he's all by himself on this vehicle, which actually is implying this is a covert mission he's on. He's not with other people. But that's kind of missed with your first 10 times you see the movie. But he lands on this wheel where he calls his daughter, who's Vivian Kubrick in the movie. Floyd sits down with some Russian moon dwellers, because there's bases on the moon by this time, which would have been the case had we originally gone. Why not go back? Come on. It's new real estate. But then he leaves the wheel, taking another vehicle to the moon. That's what von Braun initially said needed to happen. It would help us escaping the Earth's atmosphere. And so he had this giant wheel. It's much different looking. It's a round, tubular looking wheel in the Walt Disney special or the Walt Disney show. And he talks about how they would ferry the fuel up to that space station and hold it. Then build a separate rocket to go straight to the moon from the wheel, making the escape velocity thing a lot easier for getting away from Earth's gravitational force. Now, I don't really know if that works, but that's what he did. So when they made 2001, they just made a super science fiction version of that, which is science fiction versus science fantasy. Remember, Star Wars is science fantasy, 2001 science fiction. Science fiction is supposed to work if the technology could be developed to complete the inventions. And it's just one of the most stunning films on planet Earth, right? But that wasn't done. Von Braun was also noted, I think the year was around 1959, he wrote a paper on how big the Saturn V would have to be to have enough fuel just to do it all by itself without this intermediate station. And it was supposed to be a rocket 39 times bigger than the Empire State Building. Well, obviously that wasn't made. And if he did write that, I've tried to find that document. It's very difficult to find anything like that. Even if he wrote that paper, he wasn't obviously suggesting anyone build a rocket that big. What he's trying to put forth is you got to build this intermediate space station to then launch from. But remember, right after 72, the Russians, they tried to go to the moon, and they said they didn't have enough power to get out of Earth's orbit. Now, they had a gigantic explosion on their last launch site, which was cleaned up and covered up, but all these engines they built were stuff in a warehouse in Siberia. When those engines were dug up in the 90s, literally just preserved underneath cloth. There's a whole video documentary on Netflix about this. It's all in Russian. You have to read the captions. They found out that the engines that the Russians built in 72 were 2.5 times stronger than the most modern thruster that we had built in 1995. So imagine how much more thrust they had than the Rocketdyne engines if they're beating our 1995 engines. We bought those engines, reverse engineered them, and that's what SpaceX uses right now, as a derivative, and a very optimized derivative of what the Russians had done. But they couldn't go because they couldn't escape Earth's gravity, which makes 1,000% sense. Now, a lot of people get really bent out of shape towards the astronauts themselves for lying. I do not take that position whatsoever. You have no idea the pressure it would be on these guys. Because if they told the truth, let's just think about what would take place. Not only getting in trouble with the agencies that might take their lives, and there's one astronaut that died in Ojai near the 40th anniversary, I believe, and there was a rumor that he was going to spill the beans. But it crushes all the people that believed. It crushes this age-old parable that we went, this myth that we went. And that's a lot of damage. No matter how you divide up the results of that, it's a lot of damage to a lot of psyches. So you figure out how to go and you go. The only bummer is that if we ever do land on the moon in some pedestrian manner, now there's all kinds of rumors about the military having space bases on the dark side of the moon, whatever. But whoever went back, whoever gets there first is the first guy. There's all kinds of evidence that obviously the Vikings had made it to North America. Tons of evidence. There's all kinds of Egyptian stuff in the freaking Grand Canyon. So, and there were people here already, right? So somebody already discovered North America, but who gets the the big Chotsky for that? It's Columbus, right? Who was chased down by his own country for being a pretty bad dude, especially the little kids. It was the rumor was he died in Florida, right? Running from his country. The fascinating thing about potentially being on board with what I'm saying is that they're going to say they win again. which gives us this unbelievable opportunity to parse everything that comes back from their footage, from their movies, all that kind of stuff. I hope they make it super convincing, and I hope they're really there. I really, really do. I hope they've perfected technology to get through the Van Allen belts, to protect themselves against ambient radiation, to live in these incredible environments with 250 plus in the light, 250 below in the dark, that somehow they can ferry up enough food and supplies, water and oxygen to last a long time. Just 6 days alone, we better be seeing swapping of the air supply in these backpacks. But it'll be interesting to see how would they need a gigantic deviation from what they've already done. That'll be the very interesting thing, right? If someone told you, hey, I took this 8-cylinder Chevy and I drove 280 miles an hour down that highway on the salt flats, then if that was fake, right? And a guy then goes 300 miles an hour in the salt flats of Utah, why would he need a rocket ship to do it? Because you do. You need the rocket ships to really pull that off, right? So we got 600 mile an hour, land speed records. They're like little missiles on the ground. It's just an mind-blowing thing when you see it. But if you did it with an 8-cylinder Chevy or something, you don't need the rocket the next day. But I think this platform is going to look a lot different than the way we see the Saturn V. I think the landing mechanisms are going to have to be more than just these 4 little feet. And there was one other little tchotchke, because I got this thrown on my face the other day. They said they took photographs of the actual landing sites from space, these reconnaissance satellites that have been up there. And what's interesting is, I believe it was a Caltech group of kids, they actually asked NASA, okay, you send us a digital photograph of these tripods that are left after the lunar thing pops off the top. These photographs are so detailed, they'll show you like the rovers that are still there, footprints, tracks where the rover drove. And so the NASA kids said, what's the pixel to feet ratio, right? So when you got 1 pixel in this photograph, how big is that pixel to the ground? And someone accidentally told the truth. And I don't want to misquote it, but I do know that when they said, oh, well, based on that algorithm, this tripod is 4 times bigger than the tripod that actually was sent to the moon. Thus, it's a fake. All right? So, it just goes on and on and on. You're looking for the smoking gun going in the opposite direction, but you can't find one. The other big one that I have thrown at me every once in a while is that they put a mirror on the moon and shot a laser at it from Earth. Well, if you do your research, in the early 60s, they were bouncing lasers off the moon with no mirror. It's very difficult to do, and as I had it described to me in college, that earlier experiment, and even the one with the mirror, can take over a month to figure out the calibration to hit that thing and get anything to come back. But the funny thing is, I think we've had at least one company shoot a laser message on the surface of the moon, or they were actually going to start the company to sell advertising on the moon. They were going to project with massive lasers messages on the moon. So just like a banner being dragged by a plane. And of course, they never got started with that. But shooting a laser at the moon and seeing it with an optic from Earth, right? A big telescope hitting it, you can do it. You can see it. Hence, this business model would have never got off the ground. But hitting the moon with a laser and getting it to bounce back into an optic has been done before we got to the moon. So you might want to can that little smoking gun. There were men in the 50s that basically came out and said that you can't land on the moon because it's a plasma ball. And at first I was like, what the hell does that mean? That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And these were guys that were deep inside scientific organizations and then popped out once they started saying this stuff. They're ostracized. But the theory is that everything is a plasma ball in space. It's a big, gigantic electric ball, and the only thing that's happening is there's a crust. If you get big enough, there's a crust that's thick enough on the outside, we can actually walk around on it. Hence Mars, ourselves, Venus, Mercury, that kind of stuff. And that the moon would have to follow in line. They'll tell you the sun is a plasma core. I just watched a movie made, I think, in 1951. So the same year that The Day the Earth Stood Still movie was made. But this was a movie has 2 different titles, but it's about this nuclear bomb threat. It starts off with this guy yelling about nuclear bombs are going to kill everybody above ground. So we have to figure out a way to do the Vault-Tec vaults underneath the ground. And the movie's about building this little drill vehicle that was going to drill down inside the earth. The whole thing shot at the Carlsbad Canyons, which is where Walt Disney went to get inspiration for the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. So it's all stalagmites and stalactites as soon as they pop out underground. It's kind of funny, but they're trying to look for a suitable place to live underneath the ground. And they felt like they needed to go like hundreds of thousands of miles. They were trying to go to the center of the earth. But in the middle of this movie, this guy says, well, isn't the center of the earth, millions of degrees? And this guy says in the movie, no, the latest science is that it's actually cooler at the center of the earth, which I thought was wild. What's cool about some of these old movies is that you'll have the brightest minds in the world as technical advisors on these movies. Although I did just see one which is a ripoff of The Day the Earth Stood Still, but they leave in 56. And it was called, I think, The Man from Venus. It's the same story of Klaatu, but it's a guy from Venus. And it's just this really low-budget movie. And they actually quoted as the man had traveled hundreds of light years to get here from Venus. Hundreds of light years. It's like, well, Alpha Centauri is only 4 away, and that's the closest solar system we've got next to ours. So that technical advisory was junk, right? But what was interesting, in the same movie, they asked him about the propulsion system on his vehicle. And get this, man, 56. So what he said was, he pulls these two magnets up to this table, and he goes, positive to positive will push away, positive, negative attracts, right? He says, well, that's how our vehicle works. It has no fuel. It simply interacts with the magnetic, electrical fabric of the universe to travel through the universe. Hilarious, man. 56. And he's pretty much come up with the gravity well system that we believe to be the way the Tic Tac and the gimbal fly now, which I believe are, our vehicles. So it's been a while since I touched this. I thought since the Artemis stuff is starting to make really big claims, we'd touch this once again. So it's a good time to prepare your little spidey senses to see what's happening. It should be an interesting thing no matter what. You can definitely expect 99% of the population to believe everything that they say. Don't get upset. This is just a little club that we're in where we kind of laugh and snicker at some of the stuff. Hopefully they've got enough stuff to make us believe, but it should be really interesting. And I would expect delays. But we do have at least one ego out there to resolve, where the accomplishments in the next few years are going to be more important than anything else. So I can imagine that being part of the stimulation, but no international news about this on a daily basis. It should literally be a countdown at this point, right? They'll count down when the Super Bowl is going to happen, but not count down next time a man's going to step on the moon. Isn't that a little weird, right? I think it's a little strange. But anyway, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. Everything's up there. That's all I'm going to say today. We're on a bunch of different social media. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts.